Chapter 14. As tantalizing as this bizarre statement was, both Harry and McHugh declined to elaborate further until, as McHugh explained obliquely, "We do a quick check of the paperwork." Instead, Harry insisted that since we were already seated in a fine Indian restaurant, it would be borderline criminal not to partake in some fine Indian food. This argument was met with annoyed grumbles, but once the food began to arrive, the primary sounds from the table were simple, satisfied sighs of contentment. Once we were all sated, McHugh sat back, wiped his face with the cloth napkin, and suggested we all accompany him to his flat for some coffee, tea, and much-needed explanations. "All will be elucidated," he promised. Megan, DeVries, and I were all for it, but Roy Templeton opted out of the plan almost immediately. "Thanks for the invite. I'm as intrigued as the rest of you," he said to the group as we assembled in front of the restaurant. "But I left Roxanne alone out there at Baxter's Farm." He caught himself before completing his traditional dig at Lawrence Baxter's estate, and in deference to his host's current situation, took a decidedly kinder tone in his remarks. "She's alone out there at Larry's, and I think she'd like some company. When I called and told her the news about Hector, it hit her hard. To be honest, it's still settling in on me. Let me know what comes of this whole Archie Banks thing. And be sure to give me a call if you find Elvis as well." With that final attempt at humor, he flagged a passing cab and was gone. I put out a hand to signal another taxi for our group, but McHugh waved it away. "We're 2 minutes from Euston Station, and it's a 6-minute tube ride to my flat. Trust me, in today's traffic, we'll be better off on the train." With that, he led us to the nearby station, and less than 10 minutes later, we were exiting a different station, one which deposited us into a charming London neighborhood known as Camden Town. Upon seeing the sign announcing the station, I realized my only other experience with Camden Town had been that it was my sole spoken line in a high school production of A Christmas Carol. Due to the large number of characters in the show, a wide net had been cast for supporting players, a net which eventually captured me and a handful of other non-theater geeks. My one line came near the climax of the performance when, as the poulterer, I was dragged on stage to confront a recently transformed Ebenezer Scrooge, who instructed me to "Take this bird to Bob Cratchit, 15 Bagshot Row, Camden Town." At that point, I would utter my one line, "Camden Town?" which would then propel Scrooge into a longer spiel about how the bird was too large and how I needed a cab and so forth. Even at the time, it seemed like a lot of effort for very little payoff. I had to arrive at the theater an hour before the show, sit around in an itchy wool costume for 2 hours, and then wander on stage to say 2 words, which in reality weren't truly required to move the plot forward. To prove my point, one night I decided to skip my line altogether, which produced only a momentary pause on Scrooge's part as I stared back at him blankly. Unflustered, he launched back into his monologue, and the show continued as if nothing had gone astray. If I had to pinpoint the one moment that determined why I became a magician instead of an actor, that would be it. Ironically, the role of Ebenezer Scrooge in the production was performed by none other than Jake North, who was routinely handed all the key male roles throughout his sunny high school theatrical career. This, in turn, made him very popular with the girls. However, I took solace in the fact that while Jake was getting all the girls, I had, by the age of 16, nearly perfected the Erdnase diagonal palm shift. Turns out self-delusion is a strong force at any age. Remembering A Christmas Carol got me thinking of its famous opening line, "Marley was dead," to begin with. There is no doubt whatsoever about that. Which returned me to the purpose for this sudden expedition to McHugh's flat. The amazing suggestion that the 3 murdered magicians had been struck down by a man thought to be dead for over 30 years. Dead as a doornail, as the saying goes. Or not. I will readily confess to, during the course of my career, squirreling away copies of the occasional official ephemera that passed across my desk and piqued my interest, McHugh said, as he pulled open one of several file drawers in a cramped alcove off his small sitting room. I have, over the years, winnowed the file considerably, but I believe the document in question is one that I held on to, for reasons I hope will soon become apparent. As it is, at the very least, an interesting read. The four of us, Harry, DeVries, Megan, and I, were in his sitting room, sipping tea and nibbling on the sugar cookies McHugh had placed out before us before he began his deep dive into his filing system. Although system might have been too strong a word. Small filing cabinets were loaded on top of other, larger, mismatched filing cabinets, with stacks of paper resting precariously on top of these equally haphazard cabinet towers. While I couldn't distinguish any sort of organizational structure, it only took him about 5 minutes and what appeared to be 2 incorrect drawer dives for him to put his hands on the piece of paper that he was searching for. I have seen my share of suicide notes over the years, he said, as he turned toward the group. He held the paper up to the light to check it was, in fact, the one he was hunting for, and then turned back and closed the drawer from which he had extracted it. But this is one of the few I made a copy of, because it was, and I suspect still is, endlessly intriguing. And I think, he continued, as he lowered himself into the remaining empty chair, it may offer some insight into the events of the last 5 or 6 days. He gave the paper one last look and then handed it over to Harry. Harry glanced at the faded piece of paper while he patted his pockets, trying to determine the location of his glasses. From where I was sitting, I could see the note was handwritten and appeared to be a photocopy of the original. Harry finally gave up on his search and looked over at me. Eli, I can't find my glasses. Do you mind? He handed the paper to me and sat back in his chair, rubbing his beard thoughtfully. I looked down at the document. The photocopy was a bit smeared, however, the handwriting was so neat and precise that it was still easy to read despite the poor quality of the copy. I read the single sheet out loud. To whom it may concern, this is the only way out I can see. No other options remain. You know who you are and what you have done to me. You stabbed me in the back and poisoned my reputation. I'm already dying a death of 1,000 cuts, so I might as well go ahead and complete the job you started. You have drowned my dreams, pushed me over the edge, and I am at a point of no return. I hope you can live with that. While my career goes up in flames, you ride high on success, fueled by the failure you heaped upon me. This may be my death, but my blood is on your hands. A.B. I finished reading and turned the paper over to ensure I hadn't left anything out. Confident I had completed my assignment, I handed the paper to Davis DeVries, who took it gingerly, as if it possessed heretofore unknown explosive properties. Oh my, he said, holding the document at arm's length. He really did blame us for the nosedive his career took, didn't he? It was his own fault, Harry said firmly. It was a bizarre fiction back then, and it is equally bizarre under today's circumstances. There is honor among magicians. If you steal from your brethren, I think you shouldn't be surprised when they give you the boot. He blamed us for everything bad that happened to him, when in fact he had no one to blame but himself. I really can't, DeVries said, stammering as he looked up at McHugh and Harry. I really can't fathom what you are thinking. Are you actually suggesting Archie Banks has come back from beyond the grave and is killing us one by one? Are you suggesting that?" Harry greeted this short outburst with a warm smile. "Oh, no, Doctor. I don't believe we're suggesting anything of a supernatural or otherworldly explanation for the events of the last few days." "Absolutely," McHugh said, and I realized for the first time he was still wearing his Trilby hat, which laid to rest any question I had about him ever taking it off. I had assumed it would come off at home, which was not the case. "However," he continued, "the specific wording of this suicide note, coupled with the circumstances of the 3 recent deaths, are too analogous to be ignored." DeVries had passed the note back to me, and I read part of the note aloud. "You stabbed me in the back and poisoned my reputation." I looked up at the small group. "Well, that certainly describes what happened to Oscar and Boris." "Coincidence," DeVries huffed, clearly not getting on board with this train of thought. "Absolutely," Harry agreed. "That certainly could fall under the heading of a common coincidence. However, it's the other phrase, 'I'm already dying a death of 1,000 cuts,' which I think moves this out of the realm of coincidence and into—" He looked around the room. "Well, I'm not entirely sure where it moves us." "Archie Banks is dead," DeVries said, clearly getting annoyed at where the conversation was headed. "Yes, that is the most likely premise," McHugh said, standing up and moving across the small sitting room. The entire flat, with the exception of his office alcove, was neat and tidy and had the feel of a woman's touch in the small details. I suspected the apartment had seen very few changes since the death of Cora, McHugh's wife. Harry's apartment offered the same museum-like setting to the memory of his own late wife, my Aunt Alice. "And if you follow that line of thinking," he continued, moving to the window and pulling back a curtain to let more light into the room, "then someone is using the suicide note as a blueprint of sorts to exact a revenge on Archie Banks' magical peers." "And so far, doing a bang-up job," Harry said. "Indeed," McHugh said, returning to his chair. "The next line in the note," I said, glancing down to confirm my memory, "is 'You have drowned my dreams.' Since, so far, the killer's been going in order, I'm guessing that would be the next likely line of attack." "Of course," I added, thinking back to the large estate which was currently housing the Magi, "there aren't a lot of opportunities for drowning at Baxter's mansion. He's got a great fitness room, but no pool. I didn't see any lake out in the heath, unlike Minnesota where you can't turn around without stepping into a body of water of some size. Other than a bird bath in the garden, I'm not sure where he or she would find the opportunity." "Well, the killer got Hector into a hotel room, so I don't think we should confine the area of concern to Hampstead Heath," McHugh said. "There are plenty of bodies of water, including the Thames, which has seen its share of drowning victims to choose from, I'm afraid." "You're afraid," Harry said with a bit of a growl. "The only thing you need to be afraid of is the possibility of being collateral damage." McHugh stood behind his chair and placed his hands on top of it, straightening a small white doily which lay across it. "Admittedly," he agreed. "However, our first step must be to take this information to the fellows on the force so they can follow up on our line of thinking. That a person or persons unknown are bringing Archie Banks' words from his suicide note to life, as it were, as well as explore the other, less likely path." DeVries narrowed his eyes at McHugh and then looked to Harry. "And what is that other, less likely path?" "The other line of thinking, as absurd as it might be to consider, is to question a fact we always thought was beyond reproach," Harry said. "And that fact is," DeVries pressed as he folded his arms across his chest, "that Archie Banks may not actually be dead," Harry said. He turned to McHugh, who nodded in silent agreement. "This is nonsense," DeVries said when we stepped back out onto the street an hour later. I sensed from his mood he was an unlikely subway candidate at the moment, so I began to scan the street for an available taxi. "I would not say nonsense," Harry said. "Bizarre, yes. Implausible by all means. But this is a deadly business, and it cannot be treated lightly." DeVries harumphed and took up his own search for a cab, looking down the street in the opposite direction from where I was looking. I wasn't entirely in his camp about Archie Banks at this point, but I was also far from convinced by the events of the last hour. McHugh had spent a good deal of that time on the phone with Detective Inspector Matthews, suggesting in which file she could find the original copy of Archie Banks' suicide note and offering several possible directions in which the investigation could head. Most seemed reasonable to me, but one felt absolutely gothic. "And they are actually considering exhuming Banks's body?" DeVries said, turning back from his cab search. "Literally, digging up the past?" "That would put one of the theories to rest," Harry said quietly. "Nonsense," DeVries repeated, and returned to his taxi search. "Let's get back to the Heath and see how Baxter's holding up." One of the pieces of information McHugh had gleaned in his phone call was that the police had finished their initial interview with Lawrence Baxter, and he had been released without any charges being filed. "What's so odd about this," I said, ignoring DeVries' peek, "is how all the murders implicate Baxter. But at the same time, they don't." "What do you mean?" Harry said. I could see DeVries had turned slightly so he could listen, while still pretending to be deeply engrossed in the hunt for transportation. "Well, he is the president of the board at the Magic Circle, but he was not particularly involved in the setup or rehearsal for the event which took Oscar Carhonen's life. And he was the host for the house party where Boris was poisoned, but it was determined Boris's tea bags were likely tampered with long before he arrived at Baxter's Folly." I stopped myself, a little ashamed of having adopted Roy Templeton's term for Baxter's estate. And finally, a third house guest of his was found murdered using techniques that require medical expertise. However, it didn't happen in his house, but instead at a hotel, miles away. Harry considered what I had said. "And what does all that mean?" I shook my head. "I actually don't know. It might mean nothing at all." DeVries had succeeded in hailing a cab and was ushering us toward its open rear door. "Well, here's one thing I do know that is absolutely true," Harry said before we climbed into the taxi. "I really wish I had packed more than this one pair of shoes." I looked down at his feet, sporting a fine pair of black Italian leather shoes, which were as polished and pristine as the day he had bought them. "Why is that?" Harry turned and looked up at McHugh's flat. "Because if I know my friend, I would imagine in the next day or so, I will be wearing these very shoes while we traipse and trample through a muddy cemetery in search of a ghost." He was partially correct in his prediction, but as it turned out, it was my far less expensive pair of Jack Purcell sneakers that were about to do all the traipsing.